ladies and gentlemen, our national anthem. Please stand.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched was so gallantly streaming on the rocket's brave gleam. The bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, sailors, that star-spangled banner yet wave, for the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Order. Left turn. Halt.
Commander Wilson, United States Navy, will now offer the invocation.
Let us pray. Father, this day is bright for all who declare life and liberty the sweetest gifts. As the Navy honors Admiral Stockdale and his family today, we pray for the same strong endurance, thoughtful leadership, and spirited resistance. May the building we dedicate, worn by time and renewed with care, remind us always of heroes in our midst. Amen.
Will all guests please be seated? Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Rip Sirhan, United States Navy, Commanding Officer, Fleet Aviation Specialized Operational Training Group, Pacific Fleet.
Admiral Preer, Vice Admiral Mrs. Stockdale, Vice Admiral and Mrs. Martin, Vice Admiral Bennett, Rear Admiral Beard, Rear Admiral Butler, Rear Admiral Yakeley, Mayor Herron, distinguished former prisoners of war, and I'd like to mention their names. Vice Admiral Martin, Captains Inch, Stark, Black, Carey, McGrath, who came in from Colorado, Captain Southwick, Hutton, and Woods. We have Commanders Bettinger and Lewis, Lieutenant Riemann, our own Doug Higdal and Jesse McElroy. Jesse was a Korean prisoner of war, former prisoner of war, and Mr. George Cooksey, who was a World War II prisoner of war. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being here. Members of the Coronado City Council. Members of the Coronado City Council, distinguished guests, and fellow members of Phaso Traeger Pack. Good morning, and thank you so much for being with us today to share in this special dedication to a very special American. I'm really glad we have good weather. Before inviting my boss, Vice Admiral Brent Bennett, to introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to provide a brief overview of SEER School for those in the audience who may not know what this Navy curriculum is about. The building you see behind me is the home of the Navy's West Coast Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape School, better known as SEER School. We estimate that we've trained approximately 97,000 students of the members of the armed forces since this school has been in existence, and that's over 40 years. It is here that the Navy and Marine pilots and other designated personnel learn how to survive and evade capture should they find themselves down behind enemy lines. Our students also undergo highly realistic training on what to expect should they become prisoners of war. Part of this training involves maintaining their military organization and resisting enemy attempts at coercion. However, the foundation of the course is rooted in the military code of conduct. The 6 principles of the code are brought to life through a meticulously crafted training syllabus, which is administered by highly trained and extremely dedicated Navy and Marine Corps instructors. We hope our students never have to use what they learn here, but as our instructors always say, we train the best for the worst. Initially, when the school first opened in the mid-50s, we drew upon the experiences of prisoners of war from World War II and Korea. One of our first students was a young Navy fighter pilot named James B. Stockdale. During the Vietnam conflict, American military personnel were once again subjected to the harsh realities of prisoner of war life. For many of these individuals, the length of their confinement was far greater than had ever been experienced by members of the armed forces. It was only upon their release in 1973 that the full extent of their brutal ordeal became known. And it was then that we learned how they were able to successfully communicate, maintain organization, and offer collective resistance against an enemy that tolerated no resistance. As the senior naval officer in the prisons of North Vietnam, James Stockdale played the key role in orchestrating the efforts of his fellow prisoners. In spite of the enemy's best efforts to break his spirit and his ability to resist, he maintained contact with his fellow Americans, set standards of conduct, and helped them to return with honor. The bottom line, the techniques Vice Admiral Stockdale devised while a prisoner in North Vietnam are today the essence of our SEER curriculum. It is only fitting that we dedicate this building to him today. It is only fitting that his name be closely associated as well with this SEER program because of its mission to train the best for the worst. And finally, my instructors asked me to recognize Vice Admiral Stockdale and all the former prisoners of war here today with a special message. And that message is encoded on these Navy signal flags on the side of the building. And the interpretation of that message is, returned with honor. And for the 2,161 Americans who are still listed as missing in action in Vietnam, and the thousands of other armed forces personnel who did not return from war in Europe and also in Korea, I'm ordering today that the POW MIA flag, the black flag on this building, be flown 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We will never forget them, and may God bless them as well. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Vice Admiral Brent Bennett, the Commander, Naval Air Force, U.S. Pacific Fleet. Vice Admiral Bennett is a proven leader in combat, in command, and in the important decision-making jobs in Washington. He is a veteran of the Vietnam conflict, having flown 222 combat missions, has had command at sea as a light attack squadron commanding officer. He was captain of USS LaSalle and had command of nuclear-powered aircraft carrier Nimitz. He also had battle group command of Carrier Group 5 and Battle Force 7 Fleet. His last assignment was in Washington, where he was Director of Air Warfare and played a significant role in shaping the composition and strike warfare capability of Navy air wings for the future. Now, as the Commander, Naval Air Force, U.S. Pacific Fleet, Vice Admiral Bennett is responsible for the training, readiness, and logistical support requirements for all West Coast aircraft carriers, air wings, naval air stations, and has oversight of over 100 operational squadrons, some 2,000 aircraft, and over 67,000 military and civilian personnel. Please join me in welcoming Vice Admiral Bennett, the Commander, Naval Air Force, U.S. Pacific Fleet.
Good morning, all. What a spectacular occasion. Admiral Mrs. Stockdale, Admiral Preer, Vice Admiral Mrs. Martin, former POWs, fellow flag officers, Mayor Herron, distinguished invited guests, What a great day it is to be a member of the United States Navy. And what an honor and a privilege it is to share this dais with men of such stature and personal character. Vice Admiral Stockdale is one of my personal heroes. Sharing that personal place in my heart, reserved for the unique band of individuals assembled this morning, is an individual who asked early this morning that I read a brief note that is full of special meaning. It reads as follows. Let me extend my personal greetings to those gathered at the building dedication ceremony for the James B. Stockdale building. As a naval officer, senior leader in the prisoner of war environment in North Vietnam, and as an American citizen, James Stockdale's name will bring great honor to the building and its purpose. Please extend my salute to him, his wonderful family, and to those gathered here in his honor. I was honored to serve under him in Hanoi and have been his admiring friend for 43 years. Signed, Jeremiah Denton. Now, my small part in this memorable ceremony that honors Vice Admiral Stockdale is to introduce our guest speaker. His professional achievements and personal exploits are detailed in your programs and offer clear testament to his unique qualifications to officiate at this dedication. Warrior, statesman, innovative, caring leader are terms that repeat themselves time and again as you read through his impressive biography. Even more importantly, the core values of honor, courage, and commitment have characterized his professional life from long before we first became shipmates as members of the class of 1964 at Annapolis. From those early days on the banks of the Severn through Vietnam, the post-Vietnam Hollow Force days, the height of the Cold War, the defense buildup, and the challenging restructuring of our military, the name Joe Pruer has been synonymous with integrity, forthrightness, clear thinking, and a genuine concern for his sailors. His recent assignment as the Vice Chief of Naval Operations and his current responsibilities as Commander-in-Chief of all U.S. military forces in the vast expanses of the Pacific Theater are emblematic of his immeasurable contributions to our Navy and our nation. Therefore, I can think of no one more appropriate to speak on behalf of a proud and grateful Navy and nation on this auspicious occasion than Admiral Joseph Pruer, Commander, Pacific Command. Please join me in welcoming back to San Diego on what is, after all, his first official visit back since assuming his new responsibilities, Admiral Joseph Pruer.
It's an embarrassing introduction, and the one actually unique qualification that Brent might have omitted in that, and I didn't notice any of you dozing off yet, but is a friend of the Stockdales, which I'm proud to be. Admiral and Ms. Stockdale, Admiral and Ms. Martin, Stockdale family, Admiral and Mrs. Bennett, Mayor Herron, Captain Sirhan, POWs, former POWs, thankfully, friends of the Stockdales, admirers of the Stockdales who are coincident, the staff here at Siri School. It's just great to be back here in Coronado. The city has a large grip on the heart of all the Pruers, and I'm glad to be back here. Suzanne is sad that she can't be with you. But it's a particular honor for me to be here with Jim and Sybil Stockdale today. Though Suzanne and I, as I've mentioned, count you as friends, being with you is always humbling. It's always enriching. I have a great deal of admiration for what you do, and how you live your lives. And in a few moments, we're going to dedicate a building in the name of Jim Stockdale. But the building is just bricks and mortar, and in this case, some wood, and a lot of loving care by a lot of people I know. But what it represents is a lot more significant than that, and it represents the struggle to survive in combat for all of us, particularly for Navy and people and some Marines that go through here. In our last few wars, those have been naval aviators for the most part. And I'll tip my hat to you, Doug, as one of those who has struggled and survived so well. But the staff here will teach tactics, techniques, and procedures known in our acronym-rich vocabulary as TT&P. But most important is the Stockdale factor, and that's what he brings. Admiral Jim Stockdale brings to this curriculum a compass that's aligned to true north through thick and thin, and he brings an unconquerable soul, and that's what we're here to dedicate today. I'd like to focus for just a moment on what I think is an important theme, and it's epitomized by the way that Jim and Sybil Stockdale conduct themselves and conduct their lives, and that's the notion of special trust and confidence. Special trust and confidence is a phrase that comes from the preamble to the oath of office that all of us in uniform take, and it talks about reposing special trust and confidence in us. And this special trust and confidence is between us, we that wear the uniform, and our nation. It's between us and our services, the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, Coast Guard. It is between us and our shipmates, the people with whom we serve, and it's between us and our families. Think about the people represented here. Think about the POWs. Largely, these men arrived in Vietnam, for the case of most of them. They came down in parachutes. Again, tipping my hat to you, Doug. Came a different way. But they were stripped of all their possessions, all the things they had. They were stripped of contact with friends. They were stripped of contact with loved ones. They were stripped of basic things, food, clothing, and shelter, the necessities of life. They were in a hostile place. They were in a very degrading place. Their only possessions were a faith in God, I hope, and that special trust and confidence, that bond that they had between their nation, their shipmates, the people they were with, and their families. That's all they had left. Gradually, under the leadership of Admiral James Stockdale and others, they rebuilt. And they rebuilt a foundation, they rebuilt a community, and they rebuilt on foundations of faith and that special trust and confidence that they had in each other. I want to talk for just a second about why our oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States has that phrase, special trust and confidence, in it. Why is it expected that the people in uniform will be held to a higher standard of trust and confidence than others might be? One of the reasons is there is a bond among us, and needs to be among us, in combat. Day to day, it may not be stressed, but when we are in combat, that special trust and confidence is the glue that makes things work. We must depend on the veracity and the performance of each other for our very lives, and that's a dependence that we have to hold dear. The second one is that our nation entrusts those of us in uniform not only with the firepower, but also with the decision-making which expends the most precious treasure we have, which is the lives and the time and talent of the sons and daughters of our nation. So our nation has a right, and we have a right, to expect more of each other than average. We need to work at an extremely high standard. This is that special trust and confidence. I'll get off my soapbox in a minute, but the facts are that there is no one of whom I know who better embodies or epitomizes this special trust and confidence than Admiral James Stockdale. Thank you, sir. A second point with respect to special trust and confidence, and I mentioned about the nation, the services, our shipmates, and our families. is that this special trust and confidence is a two-way street. It has to flow both ways, between the nation and the individual, families and the individual, services and the individual, and so forth. Sybil Stockdale, in the family mode, is equally strong, equally committed, and equally influential on all those whom she sees. During the POW days, Sybil Stockdale geared up and marshaled forces to remind the nation that that special trust and confidence was a two-way street. And for that, there are many of us here who thank you for that, Sybil. Thank you. For all of us who look for beacons to align our compasses, the Stockdale family is the brightest one you can find. And it's very pleasing and it's an honor for all of us to be here with them today. In a moment, the floor goes to the honoree, and you'll hear from Admiral Stockdale, but I'd like to make a couple of more points. Most of us certainly know about James Stockdale. A lot of us have read many of his writings. I know they've had a profound influence on the way I try to conduct the way I act. They've had a profound influence on the way my children try to conduct the way they act. But there are a couple of other things that, characteristics other than those we've mentioned, that CAG Stockdale has that we would all bear in mind and be good for us to do so. First, he's always been very forehanded. What we don't read about so much is CAG Stockdale, before he became a POW. There are several times he spent with his air wing, with the officers in his air wing, getting them to think about the moral aspects of what they were doing, thinking about their commitment to what they were doing, and preparing themselves for what might happen to them. This prepared them for the eventuality that they might be POWs. The worst might happen to the best. He gave them the notion of commitment, the phrase government time, that once you're into the fray, that's no time to be thinking about the quality of your commitment. That's the time to be acting. The time to be thinking about your commitment is beforehand. Leaders today need to keep that in mind as well. Subsequent to the repatriation of the Vietnam POWs in the mid-70s, our national security in our nation was held prey to a group of systems analysts who perhaps had no particular values ascribed to what they did. Jim Stockdale again took the torch in his writings when he was from his position at the War College and others. He helped realign our Navy to true north. He helped re-vector our Navy in the right direction, and those directions that he gave with a moral foundation and basis are equally valid today. Now, I'd like to give a memento to this bona fide teacher, philosopher, fighter pilot, husband, and genuine hero. We have a group with whom many of you are familiar called Joint Task Force Full Accounting, which is charged with recovering the POWs and MIAs and KIAs from the previous wars. In their work, the Hanoi Hilton is being torn down, and it is torn down. Admiral Stockdale continues to stand tall. Representing this fact is a memento here. This is a brick from the Hanoi Hilton. It's in a koa wood, and it's indigenous to both Vietnam and happens to be indigenous to Hawaii as well. And it's to Vice Admiral James B. Stockdale, teacher, philosopher, fighter pilot, and hero.
Really, thank you, Admiral Brewer, my pal
Thank
Joe,
you, sir.
for such a personal, warm, good-feeling talk to both me and Siv. This is a great day for me.
Thank you, sir.
It's largely supported by your great efforts to come and speak.
I wouldn't miss it, sir.
All right. Okay, my focus is not going to be too long, but as I've been personally praised, I want to document the excellence of the Navy in the prison experience we faced and this school and its reputation over the years. There was a famous series of articles in the New Yorker magazines of those years that later became a book entitled In Every War But One. And the gist of that book was that in prison camps for Americans, it was every man for himself. Now, since those days, I've come to know officers who were prisoners of war there in Korea and China, and I now see much of that as selective reporting and in general as a bum rap. However, there were cases of young soldiers who were confused by the times, scared to death in sub-zero weather, treating each other like dogs fighting over scraps of food, and throwing each other out in the snow to die, and nobody doing anything about it. General Dwight Eisenhower became president soon after the Korean War ended and said such a situation would not do. He picked a panel of trusted ex-military friends and asked them to draft an American fighting man's code of conduct that would fix the matter. It is written in the form of a personal pledge, and this is the one I remembered in those minute or two in the parachute. If I become a prisoner, Article 4, if I become a prisoner of war, I will keep faith with my fellow prisoners. I will give no information or take part in any action which might be harmful to my comrades. If I am senior, I will take command. If not, I will obey the lawful orders over those appointed over me, and will back them up in every way, unquote. In other words, as of the moment Eisenhower signed that document, American prisoners of war were never to escape the chain of command. The war goes on behind bars. As an insider, I was the Oriskany's CAG. I knew the whole setup, that as I landed, the North Vietnamese already held about 25 prisoners, probably in Hanoi, that I was the only wing commander to survive an ejection, and that I would be their senior, their commanding officer, and very likely would remain so throughout this war, which I felt sure would last at least another 5 years. I got about that far in my reverie in the parachute when I touched down on the main street of a little town, was gang tackled and mauled and wound up with a very badly broken leg. I said to myself, here I am, starting the most important job I'll probably ever have, crippled and lying flat on my back in the street. Well, that worked out better than I thought it would. The leg never was set, but in sight of a year, I was able to limp around okay, and now, 30 years after that, I'm still limping around okay. The Korean War ended in 1953. The Code of Conduct was promulgated by a federal executive order on 17 August 1955, and the man who was the pen man, the wordsmith for Eisenhower's panel who wrote that code was SLA, 3 initials, Marshall, known as Slam Marshall. He was a close friend of Ike's, served in the infantry in the trenches of World War I, became a well-respected newspaper man, stayed in the National Guard up through Brigadier General and fought in World War II. Little short fellow. He looked me up when I got home and asked with a sly grin, "How did you cope with that name, rank, serial number, and date of birth provision in the code?" When I said it was flat out impossible to hold of those big four in the torture stations of the North Vietnam prisons, he shook his head and said, "Those pre-war service chiefs completely misread the meaning of my sentence, which was, quote, I am bound to give only name, rank, service number, and date of birth, unquote." I took that language right out of 19th century international law, where the sentence clearly meant that I am obliged to give only name, rank, and so forth. As soon as the ink dried on the code, those chiefs of the services started having a macho contest to see who could most harshly misinterpret my sentence. I never meant that you were not to say anything but those four. I tried to get Ike to call the chiefs in and straighten them out, but he never got around to it. Nice little fellow, no longer with us. This Navy school and its counterpart in Maine and the Air Force's schools and the Army's at Fort Bragg all came into existence, as Rip said, to teach the Code of Conduct. An officer came here to set up the Navy West Coast Code of Conduct training in 1955. In 1957, he was relieved by Lieutenant Commander Bob Chilton, a World War II fighter pilot. Bob stayed in charge of this SEER training and survival school for 9 full years, and whenever training was going on at Warner Springs, he was there. Please stand up, Bob Chilton. I'll address a few remarks right to you. You can stay seated. You were still in the job in 1966. You prepared us for the Vietnam War. I went through Bob's training first in the year he came, 57, and repeated the course in 62. The word then was you go through the school each time you leave shore duty to take another carrier-based flying job. Bob was a natural. He believed he had a sacred mission to perform, and it showed when he spoke. Many of my friends in Vietnam prisons felt privileged to have gotten the message from Chilton himself. And that message was, stick together in prison, shoulder to shoulder. And that leadership by example is the only thing that works in there. We thank you for that, Bob. We remember that. I want to present a snapshot of how leadership by example worked for the U.S. Navy troops who stuck together in there. The place and time for this snapshot will be Wallow Prison in Hanoi on October 25th, 1967. At that point, the prison population was 267. All American military air crewmen, nothing else in there. 5 of them were Marines, 88 were Navy, and 174 Air Force. The Navy was outnumbered by the Air Force 2-1, and with each service having an almost identical distribution of rank. The Air Force had proportionately more of everything, more senior officers by count, and so forth. Before we came out, the prisoner population was to expand to twice that number, over 500. But that was 5 years and 5 months up the road. That remaining 5 years and 5 months was to see bombing cease for over 3 years straight, almost as long as America fought World War II, and then start again, much to our relief. No, you'll understand. Torture was to stop at the end of 69. The December 72 B-52 bombings won the war as far as we were concerned, and so on. But before I get to the snapshot date, I've got to give you some buildup. That summer of 67 was to see torture at its height. U.S. tactical bombings almost every day, Hanoi City power outages, city water outages. It was the summer of what John Hubble's book POW calls, quote, the meanest of times. In that meanest of times in that prison system. I was then a 44-year-old Navy captain. I found out that I'd gotten promoted since I'd been shot down by a new shoot down. And I was running the underground, leading the resistance. And as always happened, we were eventually found out and hammered. The rhythm of life was build an organization, have it purged. Build another organization, have it torn down, and so on. You couldn't give up. You had to put out rules and meet the enemy's thrusts in spurts whenever you could get the leverage on the system. I had had a so-called trial in September 67. It was in the Nobby room, which is in the corner of the Block Square Wallow prison we call New Guy Village. The name Nobby came from the big ice cream dipper-sized blobs of mortar they had stuck on the inner walls as a soundproofing measure to dampen the screams of guys taking the ropes. I saw them sticking those knobs on years before. In my prison rags, I was brought before a panel of senior Vietnamese officers, only one of whom, a front office puke, I had ever seen before. I stood before them as they sat at a long table. The enlisted torture guards, Pig Eye and Big Ug, bracketed me, and behind them was a semicircle of soldiers with rifles at the trail with fixed bayonets behind. It's all for show. The trial didn't last very long. It had only one purpose, for me to confess my, quote, crimes, unquote, of, quote, inciting the other criminals to oppose the camp authority. Of course, I refused to confess anything. I looked them in the eye and said no. And on cue, Big Ug knocked me down with a haymaker punch, and Pig Eye went to work shackling me to the long, heavy bar with ankle lugs for the rope treatment. All this was taking place just a few feet from the noses of those 7 senior officers in uniform, but without rank badges, as was standard. Pig Eye had probably put me through the ropes at least 10 times in the preceding months. He was a man about my size and age, with mannerisms more like Jack LaLanne or an athletic trainer than a brute. Big Ugg was the brute. I knew them both inside out, and they knew me both inside out. Both knew me inside out. Pig Eye spoke not a word of English and was absolutely emotionless, thus his nickname. He knew how to go for the jugular in a matter of minutes and get you to submit in a mixture of claustrophobia, pain from distended limbs, and anxiety over upper body blood circulation stoppage. I think he was nervous in the presence of these strange officers. I knew him well enough to think that's probably right. And for the first time, he applied tension to my bad leg instead of my good one. And before I could warn him, the knee cartilage I had seen so mercifully build up to allow me to walk upright popped with a bang. Everybody in the room heard it. Nothing more was said to me. I was in pain, dismayed, discombobulated, and I may have passed out for a few minutes. Then I became conscious of the fact that everybody but Pig Eye had left the room. He had been ordered to strip me naked, blindfold me, cuff my hands behind me. He took everything out of the room but me, even my toilet can, locked the door, left, and there I lay for over a month. The Vietnamese communist prison policy was not a replay of Japanese fanaticism in World War II, where recreational American prisoner bashing was encouraged. The communists in Hanoi were too smart, too cagey to lose their steam on an ego binge. They were payoff-oriented and designed a so-called rational program of intimidation and demoralization wherein no American got physically hurt, that is badly hurt, until he flatly refused to cooperate, looked the interrogator in the eye and said no, or sometimes no, by God, over my dead body. And no was what our hardcore of principally Navy seniors were crying out. I was left on that floor, naked, blindfolded, scooching around on my bare rear end, eliminating without the benefit of a bucket, half handcuffed, hands behind, all of every night, lying on my side, holding back screams of panic while the mosquitoes held a field day on my back. As the weeks went by, everything seemed to be on hold. What was really happening was that the North Vietnamese were coming face to face with the fact that American leadership by example was coalescing American prisoners in united resistance to their campaign, which was to make us U.S. prisoners yet another front in the vocal U.S. anti-war movement, and they decided to exile rather than try to beat down our hardline leadership by example cadre. Get those criminals with all that solo time and torture scars out of sight. They're ruining our game. Something like that they had probably said to each other. And now it's time for the snapshot. It was nighttime, October 25th, 1967. I was as near to breaking down and calling for mercy as I ever was when I heard a key in the door and then felt a hand unlocking my cuffs behind me. And then sensed my old clothes and a crutch being brought in, and hallelujah. I was still blindfolded, gotten on my feet for the first time in 6 weeks, and being helped up to a jeep. After a ride of about a mile, I was hobbled through numerous gates and doorways that had to be unlocked and locked behind me, and finally we stopped. The cell door was open, I was let in, the blindfold was removed, I was spun around, pushed back on the floor, leg irons put on and locked. Boy, was I happy. I really was. The guard left, locked the cell door, and I looked up at that bright single bulb and I said, thank God, this was the biggest blindfold I've ever been in. A month in that thing was really bad. Next morning we started tapping on walls to see who else was there. By the end of that accounting, I realized